Hormones are like text messages in the body. They're these proteins that get released usually in one part of the body and they go to another part of the body to tell it what to do.
We were just talking before we got started about this really interesting phenomenon. There are millions of people right now dedicated to getting healthier.
Yes.
But of course, they're thinking from a conventional mindset. They're dieting, they're exercising, they're following all these rules, doing so many things right. That's what they feel to be right. And yet they're struggling to lose weight. There's a huge component that's not being addressed, and it has to do with stress. Can you talk about how excess stress and stress-related hormones like cortisol can lead to more weight gain and even block our ability to lose weight?
It's such a critical point. I feel like this was my story when I was in my 30s. So I had a couple of kids, I was trying to lose the baby weight, and nothing seemed to be working. Like all the things I used to try in my 20s just wouldn't pass muster anymore. And what I realized was that I was a total stress case. I had what I would call now high perceived stress. So even if you looked at my life and you looked at, okay, I was a practicing physician and I was working long hours and I had 2 kids at home and all those things, but there were a few pieces that I think are really relevant for our listeners. One is that I have a history of trauma, and I think that changes your stress response system. Not just I think it, I know it. And I think that's really critical. Like we know this from the research that's been done by Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai, where she looked at the offspring of Holocaust survivors and also people who were in the 9/11 terrorist bombings. And she's shown how soul wounds can be passed on. So it may not even be you. It could be that it's your parents or your grandparents or someone else in your lineage who's passed on this tendency toward metabolic dysfunction. And we can talk more about the research if you want to, but the 2 groups of genes that get affected in terms of how they talk to the rest of the body when you've got toxic stress are your metabolism and your immune system. Really critical. And we know that from a study called Project Ice Storm. So maybe we could link to that in the show notes and talk about it if you want. But more, this garden variety stressor experience that people have, I think of it in 2 different categories. I think of, kind of the capital T trauma, the things that all of us would agree are really traumatic, like surviving 9/11 or being in a car crash. And then there's these small t traumas that some of us, myself included, can get somewhat bent out of shape over. And that could be, a breakup with a partner. It could be an email that you receive that upsets you. There's so many different things that fit into that small t trauma. And then the question is, what's the downstream consequence of that? And it's got a lot of downstream consequences. I mean, it affects the microbiome. It can give you increased intestinal permeability, leaky gut. It can stimulate the cortisol receptors in your abdomen. So abdominal fat has 4 times the cortisol receptors as fat elsewhere. So if you're like me and you're in your 30s and you're so stressed out and you've got so much cortisol kind of floating through your blood vessels, it really stimulates that belly fat. And then it can block the production of a lot of the sex hormones that help you with metabolism. Things like testosterone and progesterone, which in women is really important for sleep and for soothing. But it's important in men too. Then there's the effect on insulin, which you and I have talked about before. And a lot of people don't appreciate that, it's not just what you're eating that affects your dance with insulin and then downstream what's happening with your glucose levels, which is probably the best way to really assess your metabolic health. But stress has a huge impact. Whenever I wear a continuous glucose monitor, I could eat like an ideal hormonal specimen. But if I'm stressed, my glucose is going to be 10, 20, 30 points higher than it should be. And so really understanding the role of cortisol, I think, is critical.
Now, this is another thing we don't think about in regards to our blood sugar. Even, when we think of that, we generally put that in a pithy box of like food is going to influence that. But your thoughts and your perceived stress as well. And I noticed that too, wearing a CGM, that my blood sugar is pretty adaptable, as far as like when I eat different things. But one day when I was definitely running a little bit hot, had more stress than usual. That's when it went bonkers.
Yeah.
The first time I really noticed that.
You run hot, Shawn? I don't think I've seen you run hot.
I mean, I've worked to, be able to channel my aggression, but of course it happens to me too.
Yeah.
So I just yesterday was looking at this really interesting paper, and first and foremost, when you're talking about these advanced childhood experiences or events, these ACEs.
Yes.
And there's a lot of phenomenal research on this. And this particular paper, this was just published in 2019, and it was titled Adverse Childhood Experiences in the Onset of Chronic Disease in Young Adulthood.
Yes.
And finding that these traumatic experiences that also can get passed down, by the way, transgenerationally. And there's another paper on that as well. Basically, there's alterations in our genes, but also non-genomic aspects of how our cells are functioning. Basically, our sex cells in particular are getting altered, passing that information down to our kids.
Yes.
Possibly making them more adaptable or more suited to live in a hostile environment, right? So more propensity towards being reclusive, more propensity towards being aggressive, more propensity towards holding on to more belly fat and fat in general, because you might need to hide, right? These are all evolutionary adaptations that in a way help us to survive, but not necessarily to thrive. And so my question is, obviously, well, first and foremost, can you share what hormones actually are and talk a little bit more about, you mentioned an ice study. What was that study?
Oh, the ice storm.
The ice storm study. All right. So first and foremost, what are hormones, and how does cortisol in particular, said there's up to 4 times more receptors in our belly fat for cortisol's bananas. How does cortisol, number one, on one side of the equation, what if it's elevated, and also what if it's too low? All right, so
Yes.
that's a lot there to unpack, but first, what are hormones?
So hormones are like text messages in the body. They're these proteins that get released usually in one part of the body, and they go to another part of the body to tell it what to do. They drive what we're interested in, and that's classic endocrinology, the study of hormones. The one I can think of in particular is you produce thyroid hormone in this butterfly-shaped gland in your neck. You've got thyroid hormone receptors on almost every cell in your body. And it's kind of like the gas pedal in a car, where the thyroid hormone then tells your cells like how fast or slow to be in metabolism. So it's a way of kind of tracking the way that you burn calories, and it's so critical for many different functions, growth, repair, etc. We also know that there's this thing called intracrinology, and that's as opposed to classic endocrinology, and that's where you produce hormones inside of a cell as needed, usually from DHEA. So we've got those two different systems, but I think for our purposes, think of it as a text message that's being sent, throughout the body. And with cortisol, you asked about, what's going on with cortisol. Cortisol, I think of as the highest priority in terms of hormones in the body. So there's hormones that you might think of, things like estrogen, testosterone, DHEA, progesterone. Those are not necessarily needed to live. So you can get away without them. So a lot of women who go through menopause, men who go through andropause, and have low testosterone, you can still function. You may not function as well, but you can still function. They're not necessary for life. Cortisol is necessary for life because it controls your blood sugar, as we talked about. It also modulates your immune system. And it's one of those hormones, it's the chief hormone of your stress response. And so it's designed to help you if you encounter a threat, like a tiger, to run or to fight or to, in the case more so for women, because women have a different stress response, freeze or fawn. So cortisol is the main actor behind the stress response. And what I see in my practice is that probably 97 to 98% of people have a problem with their cortisol, and they don't know it. So it could be high cortisol, which was my story in my 30s. That was kind of the central problem that I had with belly fat and weight loss resistance. So when I measured my blood level of cortisol, it was about 3 times what it should have been. And I remember talking to a psychiatrist friend at the time, and I was like, Luann Brizendine, I was like, why is my cortisol so high? And she said, girl, every female physician I know has a cortisol that's 2 to 3 times what it should be. It's just the nature of being in a stressful system. And then there are people who have low cortisol. They've gone through a phase of overproducing cortisol in response to their environment. And now they're in a state where they don't make enough. And so there's this gap that they feel. Like they wake up in the morning and instead of jumping out of bed, like I imagine you do, and start dancing with Anne, they put their feet on the floor and they're like, oh, I don't feel restored. I need Shawn's book, Sleep Smarter. So and even for, some folks, they have high and low cortisol within the same day. So it's not just your level of cortisol, which is supposed to peak within 30 minutes of when you wake up and then gradually decline. It's also, what does the shape look like? What's the cortisol awakening response? What's your cortisol when you first wake up, 30 minutes later, 60 minutes later? What's your diurnal cortisol? Because cortisol is kind of like a flower, like a gazania that opens in the morning and then slowly closes. And a lot of people lose those patterns, which lead to more immune dysfunction, more of those chronic diseases that you mentioned associated with the ACE study. And I'm so glad you brought up the ACE study because you reach so many millions of people. And a lot of folks don't realize that some of those challenges that you and I had in our childhood, even if we're quite resilient now as adults, they then map to 40 different chronic diseases as you get older, whether that's mental health, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or physical health, like immune dysfunction, autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, all the, most of the main killers in the US.
Yeah, and it's so obvious once we realize that our thoughts create chemistry.
Yes.
And obviously, again, you talked about this really interesting connection between cortisol and possible weight gain, but you also mentioned the thyroid earlier, and the thyroid and cortisol have an intimate connection.
Yes.
They're all along that HPA axis. And so the thing that you said that is, I don't want people to miss, is that our thyroid and associated hormones can essentially downregulate or upregulate our metabolism. So we might be cutting calories, but your body's perceived stress or threats can downregulate your metabolism, can slow things down. And then this is where people start to get into that self-defeating or learned helplessness.
Yes.
Because there's like, I'm cutting the calories, I'm doing the exercise, but my weight isn't budging.
Critical point. So there's all this interdependence between these hormonal systems. And I feel like you just described it perfectly. So what we know with thyroid, for instance, is that if you're a stress case like I was in my 30s until I became a yoga teacher and, started to meditate every day, which is really essential for those of us who have ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, before age 3. Got to have a daily mind-body practice, essential, non-negotiable. So when you've got high perceived stress, it can block thyroid function, as you described. So there's so many things that can do it. It's not just high stress, but cortisol is a big part of the story with how you up or down regulate your thyroid function. There's the role of nutrients, copper, zinc, selenium, iodine. There's the role of vitamin D, which is so essential for thyroid function. And then there's this piece that I think is so important, that the body has a few different brakes in the system. And by this, I mean, like a handbrake you have in the car. And one of the brakes is that if you're under a lot of stress, the handbrake that goes on with your thyroid is called reverse T3. So you start to make more reverse T3, which blocks thyroid receptors if you're under a lot of stress. And what I see with a lot of folks, because I measure reverse T3 along with a full thyroid panel and I measure cortisol, is that a lot of folks will go through a stressful situation, even potentially like low carb, reducing their carbs, to a significant degree. That is perceived as by the body as stressful. And so that can potentially raise reverse T3. It's designed to be this emergency brake that you use like if you're in an intensive care unit. But what I see is that a lot of people have those small T traumas, those little slights that aggregate and lead to this toxic stress response that can lead to weight loss resistance, can lead to the thyroid not working the way it should, can lead to dysregulation of the cortisol. You said one other thing that I want to highlight that I think is really important. And you know how I like to nerd out with you. So this is a nerd moment. I'll just call it out. So I think of the control system for your hormones as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So you've got your brain kind of talking to your adrenal glands. That's where you make your sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, etc. But there's a bigger control system that we're still learning about. And that includes the thyroid, it includes the gut, and it includes the gonads. So testes in men, ovaries in women. And so the way I think of it is not just the HPA, I think of it as the HPA-TGG. So hypothalamic pituitary, adrenal, thyroid, gonadal, gut axis. It's quite a mouthful, but that's kind of the bigger control system that we want to be thinking about.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. The next thing I was going to reference is that even when we're testing a hormone, for example, we cannot look at that thing in isolation.
Yes.
None of our hormones are operating in a vacuum. And all of these powerful metabolic stations in our bodies are deeply connected and interacting. And so we tend to identify like, my adrenals are whatever, dysfunctional, but it's just like your adrenals are part of a much bigger system. And the conventional thinking is like, we got to try to hammer away and address that broken piece, where in reality, this could be something upstream or downstream that's actually causing the issue. And so if somebody is wanting, for example, to get a beat on their cortisol, again, understanding it's not operating in a vacuum, how can we actually test our cortisol?
So cortisol is interesting. I always start with blood work. So blood work is the universal language of most clinicians. So I like to start with blood work. The problem with cortisol in the blood is that you're measuring total cortisol. You're not looking at free cortisol, which is what's biologically active. It's what's coursing through your veins and, affecting distant organs like your belly fat. So what I like to do is salivary or urinary levels of cortisol. So what I do with my professional athletes, with my executives, with my everyday folks that I take care of, is I measure usually salivary cortisol first thing in the morning, that cortisol awakening response, or CAR for short. And then I look at typically urinary cortisol through the rest of the day. So when you first wake up, around noon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and before you go to bed. So that's the way I recommend testing it. Saliva is really the best when it comes to cortisol. Other hormones, there are better ways of measuring it than in saliva, but that's what I recommend. You also asked me about the Ice Storm, Project Ice Storm. Should we talk about that?
Yes.
Okay. So I get so excited about some of these things. So Project Ice Storm is a natural disaster that occurred a little more than 20 years ago. So this happened in 1998 in Canada, like a really remote part of Canada. So they had an ice storm that occurred and people were isolated in their homes. So it was the dead of winter. There was freezing cold temperatures and people were without power for weeks. And so folks, for the most part, were under incredible stress. They were really cold. They didn't have heat. They didn't have food. So they were highly stressed for a couple of weeks. And they took the women that were pregnant in this community during this ice storm. And then they looked at them 20 years later to look at the offspring of these women that were pregnant. And that's where they found that the sets of genes that were affected the most by that stress of the ice storm were metabolic genes and your immune system genes. So that's where we got to this idea that, okay, the offspring really struggle with their metabolism. Their weight is higher than women that weren't pregnant, who were pregnant in other locations. And so it's really important to understand that it's not just, that you feel like you're pushing a rock up the hill with trying to lose weight and weight loss resistance. There's all these other factors that we want to consider.
Oh, that is bananas.
It is bananas.
I love when researchers ask these questions and look into things like this. There's so much data available everywhere. And so I really want this message to be driven home for everybody, to feel more empowered, not to be kind of disenchanted by this, but to be empowered and understand yes, our food matters. Yes, your exercise protocol, sleep. Yes. But one of the most remarkable things about us as human beings is our ability to adapt to circumstances. And these stressors, big T or little t, can add up and create alterations in how our bodies are functioning. And so if you've been really doing well and working on these different pieces, but you can't seem to crack the code for yourself, and this is tough though, because a lot of times, and myself included, we don't acknowledge the stress that we're under.
It's true.
Right? And
Yeah.
so we might, I'm not stressed. I'm not stressed at work. No. We have an overall stress load. And this can be, even your diet stress, right? That can go in as a piece of the equation. Your environment stress, relationship stress. You can have even more kind of like a psychological or spiritual stress and not
Yes.
feeling like I'm connected or on purpose, or all these things are added. Exercise is a stress,
It
right?
is.
So
It's
this can be
hormesis.
a hermetic stressor, right?
Yeah.
Or it can be tipping you into a place, depending on what type of exercise you're doing. And there are so many other factors that we still don't understand. We're still uncovering or learning about in our field. But, the most important thing is proactively having a stress management / processing practice. You said it's non-negotiable. When you said that, I was like, let's bookmark that moment. Non-negotiable practice for yourself.
Especially for those of us with early trauma. So, I sometimes use myself as an example, not because I think I'm so great, but because,
You are. Sorry.
that's debatable. But I had parents who divorced when I was really young. I was a year old. And I've never had a relationship with my father. And so that counts as an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. So my ACE score is about 6, which is pretty high.
Yep.
I've had some psychiatrists who count it as 7. It's, debatable. But the point that I want to make is that when you have these early childhood experiences and they occur so early, you get this kind of trigger response with stress. You go into these automatic responses that often do not serve you really well. They might serve you, if you've got that tiger chasing you, but they don't serve you when you're trying to stay married. They don't serve you when you're trying to parent. They don't serve you when you're trying to lead an organization. And so the more that we can really slow down that process and maybe even heal the way that those adverse childhood experiences affected us, the better. So I'm not saying that's the magic bullet for weight loss. What I'm saying is we all deserve to know about some of the ways that we can clean up the residue of adverse childhood experiences and adult adverse experiences too. And so those daily mind-body practices, for sure, I meditate for 30 minutes every morning, no matter what. But also, there's things like psychedelic assisted therapy that has been shown to make a gigantic difference, durable, in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I feel like a lot of my patients, even if they don't meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, they have partial PTSD, or they have what's known as subthreshold PTSD. And what I think is so promising is that many of these sacred medications that went underground in the 70s and 80s, now we know from large randomized trials, they can really help us with the way that these toxic stressors and trauma get lodged in our system. So we've talked a bit about how it affects cortisol, and you made this point that I think is critical, which is it's bigger than just cortisol, of course. My next book is about the PINE network, the psychoimmunoneuroendocrine network, and how trauma affects it. So we all know about the mental health effects of trauma. We're quite conversant. There's lots of books about that. But I think a lot of people don't connect the dots to physical health, to the weight loss resistance, to the autoimmune disease, to the dysregulation with their hormones, as we've talked about. So I think it's important that we look more broadly, especially with physical health.
This is one of the biggest issues with our system of health today, is that we've removed the mind out of the body piece, and they're really inseparable. This is so silly, silly humans. But in reality, we've got to address all these pieces. And again, this is about empowerment and realizing that you have some agency here. And essentially what I'm hearing is like being able to proactively feed ourselves some safety signals, because even food, it's a signal, it's information, right? And so by having these practices where we're allowing ourselves to process stress, how often do today, especially, we might have gone through something, we'll just say a small T or a couple, and they're just kind of building up. But rather than having time to process and really restore ourselves, allow our physiology, our mind, even that HPA access to like the to turn down a little bit if it's running hot, rather than having times for restoration and healing, we seek out some temporary relief.
Yes.
Right. So we're stressed, and we're like, let me jump on my phone to de-stress and scroll on social media, and then other parts of our brain and our physiology is just lighting up, like like I'm going to say like a Las Vegas stripper sign. I don't know why that jumped into my head.
We can work with that.
It's just like lit up. Uh-huh. Girls now, right? And we're not really realizing that that's not real restoration. That's not real processing, allowing our mind and body to heal in the process. Because the thing is, I really feel that the human body we're deeply and immaculately designed to do that if we create the space for it. Like your body knows what to do if you just give it an opportunity.
It's a magnificent point, because I think you're also saying, and tell me if this is right, that we have to personalize it.
That part, yeah.
I think that's such a part of this conversation, because what works for me in terms of working in a positive way with my adverse childhood experiences may not work for you. Not everyone wants to sit and meditate for 30 minutes. That just doesn't work. They'd rather dance, or they'd rather have sex and orgasm. There's so many different ways that you can work with your stress response. And I think it starts with an awareness of how toxic stress might be lodged in your system. And I want to call out here Nadine Burke-Harris, Dr. Harris, because she is the one who really taught me about adverse childhood experiences. She's got an incredible book called The Deepest Well. And she's a pediatrician and also the Surgeon General of California who really learned how to incentivize physicians in California to be asking about ACEs. And so she tied it to reimbursement, which I think is so important. So this awareness of your own adverse childhood experience, and I hope maybe we can have folks Google the ACE questionnaire so that they can assess that, or we can link to it. So knowing your own ACE is so important. And then to understand that it's not just, your ACE score is bad, good luck with that. It's that we've got all of these ways that we can work with it. And then to personalize it so that you can, not let that trauma continue to live on in your body and continue to maybe harm your relationships and affect your connection to meaning and purpose and the way you work out at the gym, the way you take care of yourself.
Yeah, because we're making adjustments, oftentimes unconsciously, to protect ourselves.
Yes.
And that's an admirable thing. And when we're doing that, and it is limiting our ability to experience joy, to experience good health, right? We've got to dig a little bit deeper sometimes and address these things. For example, I had no idea that I had PTSD, right? I just reserved that for like war, right? But in reality, and this was, years ago, it really struck me that, just being a child and being woken up in the middle of the night to hear, people fighting and, hearing glasses broken, tables being broken, and chairs and all this stuff and all this violence taking place in my house. And, hearing gunshots outside and the sirens and all these different things, and I realized, because I didn't acknowledge it because it was normal to me, right? And it took even far into adulthood for me to realize, no, that's not normal. And that was still in me, and it was contributing to being hyper aggressive or being reclusive and really being cautious about trusting and all these other things that I struggled with, that was limiting me. Because little did I know, and I would have never thought this even 10 years ago, that the most valuable thing in my life is my relationships. I wouldn't have thought that was a thing. It didn't come in the package of what success was and how my framing, or what I saw on TV, I guess. But truly, and for me to have really valuable and healthy relationships, I have to trust.
Yes.
And I had a problem with that because of this PTSD, because of the environment that I was surviving in. And again, it served me, kept me alive, but being so self-centered is going to block me from really being able to foster healthy relationships.
There's so much I want to say in response to that. First, I want to thank you for sharing the vulnerability, because I think so many people look up to you, and the more that we can talk about vulnerability, the better. It, as Brene Brown talks about, it leads to wholehearted living, and I so appreciate that about you. The second point is that when I first met you more than 10 years ago, and you were talking about your spine and your athleticism and how I think you had an x-ray or some sort of imaging of your spine, and the doctor said to you, you have the spine of 80-year-old. And I want to connect those dots, because I feel like so much of that experience of growing up in a home where there's violence and there's, that fear that comes up when you're lying in bed and listening to this, it leads to this broth of high cortisol it's a wear and tear hormone that can really rob you of bone strength. And it's something potentially that may have affected your bones. And I'm so glad that you were able to turn that ship around. And then the third point I want to make, and I'm thinking of Anne here, because I just adore Anne so much. And I want to have lunch again with her like we did last time I was in St. Louis. I saw a meme on Instagram, so I'm just going to call out this meme I saw yesterday that I loved. So instead of you're the average of the 5 people you hang out with the most, it was a meme about how you're the average of the 5 nervous systems that you hang out with the most. And I read that and I was like, oh, wow, that's intense. That's intense, because, you want to be thinking about that. In terms of your primary relationship, what's the nervous system like for that person? Is there some additional healing that needs to happen so that you both have this weed together where your nervous systems are the best they can possibly be? And I think about that for parenting and my daughters. What I love is that it really gets me to think about, how can I have the kind of nervous system that supports the people that are in my tribe? How can I be, the best that I can possibly be? So I just wanted to make those points in response to what you were talking about in terms of the trauma that you experienced as a child.
Yeah, thank you. And that's my wife Anne, and yeah, it is that's a game changer. The average of the 5 nervous systems. What? It is true. It's true.
I feel like I should credit somebody. I don't know who it was. So whoever you were, thank you.
Thank you. Shout out to tag the, whatever. Wow, that is profound. We don't think about that. And just even there's kind of a closer proximity or understanding that when we think about our children and what we're passing on. And it can, again, if we think that I know a lot of parents think about, especially if you've gone through stuff like trying to not mess your children up. But
I kind of give up on that. I'm just going to pay for the therapy, Shawn.
It is what it is. It's just like, let me try and mess them up a little bit less.
Yeah.
And, but in reality, it's just being alive as a human being. You're going to go through stuff, and it's equipping people with tools to be able to, again, process, manage, overcome the adversities. And we're going to be passing down templates or dispositions unknowingly, because it is what it is. And if we feel like we've passed down negative things or we've picked up negative things from our parents and grandparents, I want to share this. When I was studying that ACEs paper that I mentioned earlier, I was looking at this paper as well, like, what can we do about this? And this is published in Neuropsychopharmacology. The title of the paper, I've referenced this before on the show, but it's so important to understand, is Potential of Environmental Enrichment to Prevent Transgenerational Effects of Parental Trauma. All right. So they're looking at, factually, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents passing on these traits of trauma and stress to their offspring, ending up with you. And what the researchers uncovered was that enriching experiences right now can change what's happening with your genes, what's happening with your sex cells, and what you're passing off to your offspring. So what do these enriching environments look like? That should be the question. And you said the word earlier, it's personalized.
It's
right?
Personalized. And it's, one of the things we know from the ACE research is that if you had someone in your life, a grandmother, a family friend, who was able to hear you and see you, that the ACEs have less of an effect in terms of your future risk of chronic disease. So that's something that's not measured in the ACE questionnaire, and I think it's so important. I think, for instance, with my own situation, I had a grandmother who would pick me up from school, who was, the kind of person who was just humming and singing and dancing through her life. She had such a sweet disposition. She taught me how to fish and garden, and she just was a ton of fun. And she let me be the intense little girl that I was. So having a figure like that in your life is so critical for what you're talking about, which I would frame maybe as post-traumatic growth as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. So post-traumatic growth is so critical. And I want to call out one other thing, which I feel when I'm with you, and maybe you feel it with me as well. For some folks who go through traumatic experiences, they become fiercely self-reliant. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that fit this camp, a lot of folks who sometimes have a challenge in relationships because they had to kind of build themselves up, and they had to do it on their own without maybe the parental support that they most needed. And so that self-reliance is a great thing in terms of survival, but then it can backfire, especially in middle age, which we're defining as 40 to 65. So it can backfire in relationships. It can backfire in terms of emotional intimacy. It can backfire in terms of how you go about, as you said, being honest and transparent about what your stress situation really is. So in some ways, you got to measure it to really know what it is at an objective level, especially for people like me who are so self-reliant. I'm a terrible historian. Like, you can ask me questions. How are you doing, Sara? Are you stressed? No, I'm great. I meditated this morning. I'm good. I'm good. I want to go to the gym with you, Shawn. So there's that self-reliance that can sometimes get in the way.
Oh my goodness. Post-traumatic growth. Oh my gosh. That's so true.
I didn't come up with that. We got to credit someone else there.
All right. So, and here's the thing. I mean, it's, it's 2023. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's remixed.
Yes.
You probably said it better. No disrespect. All right. So this is really pointing to, again, an opportunity for me. I'm seeing, I haven't shared this before, but it was maybe it was like, I think maybe 8 or 9 years ago, but I had this like random pain in like my back, and structurally everything looked great, looked perfect, according to, the physician that I was seeing. And I went to see, on a recommendation, this physician, and yeah, they saw my paperwork and they saw structurally like everything looks good. I don't know, like it seemed for me as like this phantom pain, and they did a physical assessment of me, and then she said this thing, and again, I've never shared this before outside of my family. She was looking at my spine and she was like, "You don't know your father, do you?" And I'm just like, what the?
Ooh.
What? How do you? And so because of I don't know what it was. I was trying to get out of there, to be honest. And, I don't know my biological father, never met him. And what she went on to say was like, I was lacking a feeling of stability and structure and support that would come from this parental figure, right? And within about a week, again, I was dealing with this pain for maybe like 2 weeks. I'm sorry, not a week, but maybe it was like 3 or 4 days. Something hit me, like a moment of insight, that I had this stability that I developed in my life, but I didn't want to acknowledge it, right? I had this amazing wife now. I have this amazing mother-in-law. I have even amazing men in my life, mentors, who I still saw myself as like the get it on your own, the resilient guy, put the weight of the world on my shoulders. I don't need anybody. Like, it was still there and running the ship, right? I was taking steps unconsciously to try to change that perception of reality. But when I accepted, like, I have people who literally have my back stopped hurting. And that is when everything changed, in even how I was working with other people and realizing truly pretty much every physical symptom or condition has an emotional component to it.
That's right. Well, you just beautifully illustrated the psycho-immuno-neuroendocrine system at work. And I so love you sharing that story. Thank you. It made me so misty just imagining you hearing that about stability, and you grew up without a father. Because that's what fathers are meant to do. They're meant to protect us and give us that stability and give us that, feeling that you can accomplish whatever you want to accomplish. And you and I both grew up without fathers, without that stability. We had to do it ourselves. And it's a lot of stress to do that, especially when you're so young and you don't know why this is happening, why it's all put on you. So I so appreciate you sharing that. And, there's so many people who've got chronic pain, not the acute pain that you described, but they've got chronic pain as a result of the pine system being disrupted. And I think that's such an important point. I also want to call out that although I've never met my biological father, I grew up with a stepfather who is one of the most important men in my life. And I had a gap, where I didn't know him. But there are these ways that we can show up for our kids. There are ways that we can show up for people who have a trauma like you and I experienced, and can remedy some of that challenge that we experienced. And so it's never too late to address it.
Yeah.
We're learning more and more about how do you create the environment for post-traumatic growth.
Yes. And no matter where you are, or even the relationships you have right now, this is part of the gift of technology today, is like virtually having people in your life, mentors. And, same thing. I had a stepfather that stepped into the picture, and this can lead to a whole other thing. If you have parents and then there's some form of dysfunction, is being able to process. And what really created freedom for me, because that violence that I experienced in my household, with my mother and my father and my stepfather, eventually being able to love and accept and really latch on to the gifts that I got from that situation, right? So this individual with an incredible work ethic and a staple figure of discipline and also provider, right? So I'm just like, okay, I love all those things. The other things I'm going to let go of and not run my psychology, right? Because that's another thing that we get caught up on, is like, what we might have had somebody, but then they were dysfunctional or emotionally unavailable or whatever the case might be. And it's kind of like, this is a summation of a Bruce Lee quote, but taking on and absorbing what is valuable to you and discarding what is not. And that's really been a tool for me as I worked through stuff that I didn't know was bothering me, right? Because we have this romantic idea about what parenting should be, right? Even our parents should be a certain way. Even same thing with our kids, right? Same thing with our relationships. It's like a Barbie and Ken type of, I don't know what the new movie's about, but it's just like, it's supposed to be this kind of like picture perfect, whatever. And 99.999% of relationships are not like that. And, recently my stepfather passed away.
Sorry to hear that.
It was, for me, such a moment, even when I came back to St. Louis and I saw my family and we were at the funeral home, it was such a feeling of celebration and joy and gratitude. And I was able to express that and provide that. And the energy shifted in the room, and helping my little brother and sister even to reframe and to start to see, that they get to choose a story. And I'll say one more quote here. Nelson Mandela, resentment is like drinking poison, expecting it to kill your enemies, right? And carrying these things that are unknowingly a lot of times hurting us. But sometimes we know the thing, but we latch onto it because it makes us feel safe in a weird way, right? This resentment, this aggression. And so I just want to add that piece there, that regardless of your circumstances, where you came from, you have the ability to ultimately, what it boils down to is reframe things, change your perception. But you need to give yourself space. You need to give yourself time to process whatever that might look like for you. That might be meditation. That might be a yoga practice. That might be dancing. That might be filling that space, that 5 closest people to you. This could be even virtually, with people who remind you of how capable you are to change. And so today you are doing this for a whole different guild of human beings. You're working with the Philadelphia 76ers basketball team.
Yes.
Which is crazy amazing. And they have this huge competitive advantage now having you. And so my question is, I want to ask you about this, is you're now exposed to a different level of human performance. So what have you learned from this situation, and what are you doing working with these players that's helping to take them to another level?
So appreciate that question, Shawn. And the players that I have the honor and privilege to care for have been my favorite clients of all time. And not just because of their physical majesty, of which they have an abundance, but because these players that I work with have a way of being in the world where they're there to serve. And they really take that mission very seriously. And there's something about maybe, we've got LeBron playing until his late 30s. He's still going strong. There's a limit, an upper limit on how long people do well in the NBA. And so I think that creates deep presence with these players. I so appreciate that. I mean, most of them are calling me from their cars when they're driving home from the practice facility. And so they've got their car and, they're talking to me as they're driving. But there's still this deep presence. And there's this desire to have no ceiling on their performance, no ceiling. And that's what I hear from them. Like Dr. G, that's my basketball name, Dr. G. Dr. G, help me help me be the best player I possibly can. Help me be the best brother on that court. Help me lift up the team, because this is unselfish basketball. And so I've learned a lot of things about, how the cortisol load that these players have, where they're playing so hard for 2 to 3 hours a day, especially during the season and especially during playoffs. They're going so hard that they've got increased intestinal permeability. Many of them have leaky gut. Some of them have metabolic dysfunction because they've got family history of diabetes. And if they're not matching their fuel to their genetics, if the environmental gene interaction isn't working to their advantage, some of them have prediabetes. And you might say, well, if they're playing 40 minutes a night, it doesn't really matter if their glucose is high. No, actually it does. So high glucose is associated with oxidative stress. It can damage those blood vessels. A player may not see it when they're 32, but you can bet that they do when they're in their 50s and their 60s, and they start to get diagnosed with high blood pressure, and maybe their brain is not quite what it used to be. So one of my jobs is to really look at that gene-environment interaction. So I do genetics, and even though genetics don't, it doesn't predict everything. It's not, diagnostic. It can tell us about 40% of performance, capacity, injury risk, and recovery. So that's really critical, 40% in terms of, looking at an NBA team. And then we do biomarker testing. We look at thousands of biomarkers related to inflammation. And I can tell when a player went to Chick-fil-A. And I'm going to call them out on it. So we've gotten these players to the point where they each have a customized smoothie that they make each morning. I ask each one of them to drink water with electrolytes when they first wake up, and then to make a smoothie that's really designed to address their detox pathways or their oxidative stress pathways or their methylation pathways. We're filling those micronutrient gaps that we find on nutrition testing. We're healing the leaky gut, because that's just kind of the nature of the level at which they play. And then also doing everything I can to support them psycho-spiritually, because they're under a lot of stress. Some of these players are, straight out of the draft. I had one player who was 21 when we first started working together, and he posted this publicly, but I loved it. After our first couple of sessions, I said to him, "What'd you do this morning? What's your morning routine?" He said, "I got up, I meditated, I called my mom, and then I made the smoothie you told me to drink." And that just felt like, doesn't get any better, Shawn. Doesn't get any better. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Oh man, you tend to rub off on people,
Well, they're magnificent to start with, and
yeah. And so are you.
So much fun.
Listen, there's so much more in store for us, and I can't wait to have you back on again. As you mentioned earlier, you're working on a new project, you're working on a new book, so we're going to keep an eye out for that, and of course welcome you back here to share with everybody. And for now, can you let people know where they can follow you, where they can get more information and just be more in your universe?
The best way is Instagram. So I love hanging out on Instagram. So that's at Sara Gottfried MD. And then my website is the same, so saragottfriedmd.com. So those are the two places. I would say in terms of interaction, it's really Instagram.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
It's been information withheld from us for a very long time, and it is behind so much frustration, misunderstandings, and the orgasm gap, which is it's a big abyss that not even the world's greatest daredevil could jump it.